You won't believe what happened in Coronado that morning. An old man sat quietly by the roadside, in a worn-out wheelchair, dressed in a faded Navy SEAL uniform, no name tag, no medals. No one stopped. People walked past, as if he were invisible. But just minutes later, the marching SEALs suddenly halted. The entire street fell silent. And in that moment, millions of American hearts tightened with emotion. It was a soft gray morning in Elmsfield, a small town in the heart of America, where life moved so slowly it often felt as though nothing was ever urgent. Memorial Day here had never changed. Rows of folding chairs crammed along the sidewalks, paper flags planted down the street, children darting about with plastic horns squealing random notes. Around 11:30, the high school band would play a few marching tunes, followed by the bright red fire truck leading the parade. Then came the old veterans, in their faded uniforms, lining up by the war memorial, ready to walk the short stretch of blocks in remembrance, just as they did every year. But this year, one man arrived early before the organizers, before even the first chairs were set out. At the far end of Main Street, an old man sat quietly in a worn-out wheelchair. His coat was frayed, his shoes polished to a shine that caught the sunlight, and though his shoulders had stooped with age, his back remained straight, as if the habit of a soldier had never left him. His name was Frank Delaney. If you didn't live next door, you might never notice him in a crowd. Frank had never sought attention. He didn't talk about the past, nor did he care to mention the war. He wasn't remarkable, at least, not anymore. But today, he wore his uniform, not to boast, not to draw anyone's eye, but because this was the day he had chosen, Parade Day, and also the last day he knew he would ever see. A few days earlier, Frank had prepared for this moment. He had done something rare, knocked on his neighbor's door. The knock was soft, patient, yet to Emily, the elementary school teacher who had lived next door for years, it was startling. In all the time they'd been neighbors, Frank had never once come calling. People joked that it would take a miracle to get him to speak first. Emily opened the door, already bracing herself for a complaint about her daughter's soccer ball rolling into his yard. But what she saw froze her in place. Frank stood there, thin frame upright, silver hair catching the afternoon light, his trembling hand clutching a neatly folded American flag. There was no irritation on his face, only a solemn gravity. He held out the flag and, in a voice so faint it almost vanished in the wind, asked her to drive him to the parade. Just one simple request. But in his aging eyes, Emily saw something deeper. A certainty. A decision already made. Not a casual favor, but a vow. She nodded without question, though her heart sank with the feeling that this meant more than his words let on. In the days that followed, she noticed the lights in his house staying on late. Through the window, she could see Frank moving in the small room, sometimes sitting at his desk, sometimes carefully bringing out his old Navy uniform, brushing away stains with a soft brush. The fabric was faded, the buttons loose. Yet the way he tended to it was like a sacred ritual. She even smiled faintly when she saw him struggling with the old iron, as though preparing for inspection. There was a seriousness in it, but also a quiet tenderness. Frank never spoke of the pain that had gnawed at him for months. He never mentioned the cold diagnoses or the number the doctors had given him. He only told Emily one thing: "It means a great deal to me." And so, that morning, Emily stood in his small house, helping him into the old uniform. It no longer fit as it once had. The buttons strained against his waist, while the shoulders sagged wide. Yet Frank insisted on adjusting the collar himself, his fingers shaking but deliberate, as if preparing for a final review. He looked into the mirror only once, gave a slight nod, and said nothing more. In Elmsfield, everyone else was busy with the usual holiday bustle, never realizing that from the early hours at the end of Main Street, one man was already waiting. He wasn't waiting for the music, nor for the cheering crowds. He was waiting for something else, something no one in the town could imagine. because this year's parade would not be like the others. And the quiet old soldier was about to make the entire town and perhaps all of America fall silent before a truth never told. Alright, dear viewers, take a few seconds to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly feel connected to what I'm sharing. And leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a joy to see people joining us from all around the world. People often saw Frank Delaney as a frail old man, sitting on his porch with an old radio or tending to the tomato plants in his garden. But no one knew that 70 years earlier, he had been a tall, stubborn young man, forged with the iron discipline of war. That was when the world had yet to hear of Elmsfield, and Frank had just turned 18. In 1950, young Frank left the Missouri fields to enlist. Barely 2 weeks after his birthday, he signed his name on the papers and officially became a United States Marine. Few could have guessed that such a quick decision would shape his entire life. Frank didn't have the look of someone who craved attention. He was quiet, gentle, even awkward in crowds. Yet, when it came time to line up, salute, or shoulder a heavy pack, he always stood tall, his eyes steady and unblinking. The drill instructors looked at that stubborn resolve and thought to themselves, "This one can endure more than he lets on." The Korean War erupted with fury, and before Frank could even grow accustomed to the smell of gunpowder, death struck his family. His brother came home in a flag-draped coffin from Okinawa. The funeral was brief, without ceremony, swallowed in silence. Frank didn't shed a tear in public. But that night, he lay in bed with eyes wide open, and by morning, he quietly folded his uniform and boarded a ship to the front. In Korea, Frank learned to live in cold mud and under blankets of snow. Long nights dragging weary legs through trenches, mornings waking to find comrades gone, all etched into him like wounds that never healed. At times, to fight off the freezing cold and bone-deep fear, he and the others played pranks, slipping rocks into boots, or imitating the blare of an alarm just to see who would startle. Those brief bursts of laughter, against the horror around them, became their rare light. Frank seldom joined in, but he would smile faintly, shaking his head as the younger Marines fought over a scrap of chocolate from a ration pack. But not every memory carried a trace of humor. In late autumn of 1951, Frank's unit fell into a brutal ambush. Smoke and dust choked the air, bullets ricocheted off the cliffs, dirt and stone exploded around them. In the chaos, his closest friend Lance Corporal Reyes was shot twice, sprawled helpless on the ground. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Jacob Mendes, was pinned under heavy fire. Most men dove for cover, following instinct to survive. But Frank charged into danger. With one arm, he pulled Mendes out of the kill zone. With the other, he heaved Reyes onto his back. He ran nearly 400 yards through sucking mud, bullets slicing past his head. By all accounts, he should have fallen then and there. But somehow, Frank made it out with both men. Mendes lived, Reyes did not. And from that day forward, Frank never spoke of what he had done. He filed no report, accepted no medal, attended no ceremony. When comrades asked, he simply answered, "I only did what any Marine should do," then fell silent. That story faded into obscurity, remembered only by a handful of men, but for Frank, it became a scar that never healed. Because in that single moment, he had carried both life and death on his shoulders. Perhaps from then on, he chose to live quietly, as if to balance the weight. Years later, long after leaving the battlefield, Frank moved to Elmsfield. He bought a small house with a VA loan, grew tomatoes in his backyard, fed sparrows every morning, and taught himself to repair old radios to pass the time. He never married, never had children. Perhaps after losing so much, he no longer wished to tie himself to anything that could be taken away again. Elmsfield was a gentle town where everyone knew each other's faces and gossip spread like the wind. At first, Frank was the odd old man at the end of Main Street. But over time, seeing him appear at every parade, wearing his faded uniform, standing straight as though still a figure from memory, people began to call him the old soldier. They never asked for more, and he never offered, because Frank never wanted to say more. Once, Emily, the young neighbor, asked curiously, "Why do you come every year if you don't like crowds?" Frank only smiled, a smile both tender and sad, and replied, "Some of my friends I served with, they liked parades. I think I'll march for them." That answer was enough to end all questions. And in Frank's eyes there was something like regret, like the heavy burden of an invisible debt he carried all his life. The town of Elmsfield had no idea that behind that quiet exterior, Frank Delaney bore the story of a life America itself had forgotten. But no one could have predicted that during his final parade, that secret would be revealed before the eyes of everyone. Dear viewers, take a sip of water and stay with me as the story unfolds, because what comes next will surprise you. Comment 1 if you're enjoying this story, so we know you're still here with us. After the war, Frank Delaney left Korea without ever looking back. People said survivors often carried their deeds like a badge of honor, but Frank was different. He left the service in silence, as if slamming a door shut on an entire chapter of his life. No farewell party, no medals accepted, no words of parting. He simply boarded a ship and disappeared into a post-war America consumed by prosperity. In 1972, Frank chose Elmsfield as the place to settle. The town had nothing remarkable. A handful of main streets, a church, a small grocery store, and a family diner opened from dawn to dusk. But perhaps it was precisely that quietness that drew him in. Frank bought a small wooden house with a VA loan, planted tomatoes in the backyard, and built a birdhouse for the sparrows that often came by. The louder the world outside became, the more silence seemed to fill his home. Neighbors called him Silent Mr. Delaney. He rarely spoke, rarely smiled, yet was never unkind. The neighborhood kids knew him as the man who always returned their ball when it strayed into his yard. Sometimes, he even patched it with silver duct tape, a kind of upgrade gift that made them laugh and shake their heads. One boy once said that Mr. Delaney never scolded them. He would simply pick up the ball, hand it back, and occasionally mutter in his dry tone, "Next time, aim for the goal, not my window." The kids would burst out laughing, while Frank turned his back, hiding a smile in the afternoon sunday. That life might have seemed monotonous, but for Frank it was everything. He repaired old radios people had thrown away, replacing wires, adjusting knobs, bringing them back to life. Once, Emily, the elementary school teacher next door, joked that even if no one remembered his name, at least the sparrows and the radios would. Frank only raised an eyebrow and nodded, a flicker of humor in his stubborn quietness. In that moment, he seemed like an old man who had learned how to savor rare pockets of peace. And yet, every Memorial Day, people still saw Mr. Delaney appear. Not in the parade, not in the rows of honored guests, but at a humble corner of Main Street. His faded blue uniform, collar straight, eyes fixed on the marchers. He had never once missed it, except during the years when the flu pinned him to bed. When asked why he came, if he disliked noise and crowds, Frank answered with a gentle, slightly sorrowful smile, "Some of the men I served with, they like parades. I think I'll stand in for them." No one knew more than that. No one asked further. The people of Elmsfield were content with the image of the quiet old soldier, standing there every year as part of the town's memory. As if he were a clock that never missed its mark. Always in the same spot. Always in the same stance. A silent reminder that some memories must be kept, even if never spoken aloud. But beneath that calm exterior was a body growing weaker by the day. Pain came more frequently, forcing him to rely on a wheelchair instead of the legs that had once carried him across battlefields. He refused morphine, refused to waste away in a hospital bed. He wanted to be remembered not as a patient but as a soldier. And so, this year, he quietly prepared, pressing his uniform, polishing his shoes, and asking Emily to help take him to the parade one last time. Emily, though surprised, agreed. She had never seen him ask anyone for help. That morning, she arrived to find him ready, hair combed neatly, uniform straightened, the buttons strained at his stomach while the shoulders sagged loose. But Frank patiently adjusted his collar, fingers trembling yet precise, as though performing a sacred ritual. Emily wanted to ask more, but when she saw the determination in his eyes, she only smiled softly and wheeled him to the door. On the street, the crowd bustled with holiday cheer. Vendors pushed candy carts past, children shouted as they fought over balloons. No one noticed the old man in the wheelchair at the far end of the street. But if they had looked closely, they would have seen, in his eyes was not merely the anticipation of a spectator, but the gaze of a witness, someone carrying an entire generation of the fallen. Elmsfield carried on with its slow rhythm. But this year, the parade would not be like the others. For among the crowd sat a man who had not come just to watch, but to close the journey. When the clock struck noon, Main Street in Elmsfield shook with the familiar wail of a siren. The sheriff's car led the parade, red and blue lights flashing as if to demand the attention of the entire town. Right behind came a long line of vintage jeeps, draped in flags and plastic flowers, carrying veterans who waved broadly, smiling as the crowd cheered. Children pressed forward at the curb, their eyes sparkling not because they understood the solemn meaning of the day, but because they hoped for handfuls of candy tossed from the passing vehicles. Frank Delaney sat at the end of the street, in the exact corner he chose every year. His worn-out wheelchair drew no special glance. A few people gave him a nod, acknowledging his presence, but quickly turned away to their own enjoyment. To them, he was just another old veteran, choosing to sit on the sidelines rather than march. Frank did not mind. He had never come here to be seen. He came to bear witness. The school band struck up their music slightly off-key, but full of heart. The boys with brass horns puffed their cheeks red, the drums pounded in a frantic rhythm, drawing chuckles from nearby elders who covered their ears while smiling. At least they're trying. The air was both solemn and awkward, exactly the kind of charm found in small-town America, where every festival carried equal parts clumsiness and sincerity. Then came the Vietnam veterans, clad in Harley jackets covered with patches. They held flags high, their motorcycles roaring with pride, sending the children squealing with delight. Frank remained silent, eyes following each group, until he saw the sharp formation of men in dark blue uniforms, U.S. Marines. There were 47 of them. Black shoes struck the pavement in flawless cadence, eyes straight ahead, shoulders square, each step like the motion of a finely tuned machine. Frank blinked. For a moment he could almost hear the echo of boots pounding in the barracks decades ago. But this time, the difference was at the front of the column. A tall man, streaks of gray at his temples, eyes stern yet clear. He did not look like the commanders who had marched by in years past. Something in his bearing stirred recognition in Frank, like a distant memory suddenly resurfacing. As the formation approached his corner, the commander abruptly raised his hand. The entire unit halted. The music faltered into silence, as if the whole town held its breath. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion spreading. The vehicles behind slowed. The school band stumbled. A few stray notes rang out and died away. Every eye turned toward the unit, frozen in the middle of the street. The commander turned, his steps firm as he broke ranks. He crossed the street, the sound of his polished shoes striking the pavement echoing in the hush. He stopped before Frank's wheelchair, stood tall, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly. "Sergeant Frank Delaney, you are not forgotten." Main Street fell dead silent. Phones were lifted hastily, eyes widened, breaths caught. Emily, standing beside Frank, raised a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. The commander turned to the crowd, his voice ringing through the street. "Many of you do not know this man, but in 1951, In Korea, my father, Lieutenant Jacob Mendes, was shot and pinned under heavy fire. His chance of survival was none. But one Marine charged back into the hellfire, dragged him out, and carried both his commanding officer and a wounded comrade across nearly 400 yards of mud and bullets. That Marine was Sergeant Frank Delaney. Gasps swept through the crowd, whispers of disbelief and awe spreading like wildfire. Some stood slack-jawed. Mothers gripped their children's hands tighter, whispering about a true hero. The commander's voice tightened. He refused a medal. He refused to tell his story. He came to this town and lived quietly for decades, as if it never happened. But my family never forgot. And today, this entire unit marches under one name, Platoon Delaney. And then, one by one, each Marine stepped forward. They approached Frank, stood at attention, raised a salute, and whispered, "Thank you, Sergeant." 1, 2, 3, until the 47th. Each quiet phrase etched into the air, making Frank tremble. His lips quivered, his gnarled hands shook. At last he raised his arm, slowly, offering a salute of his own, shaking but proud. The crowd stood transfixed. Then a round of applause broke out, but quickly faded, as if everyone realized this honor was best preserved in silence. Tears slid down cheeks, not only Emily's Eslad, but of many who had never known who Frank truly was. The Marines snapped back into formation, resuming their march. But no one cared for the music or the floats behind them anymore, for all had just witnessed a moment that would be retold for generations. Frank closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. In that moment, he was no longer the invisible man on the sidelines. He was a witness, a hero, a living fragment of memory that an entire generation had nearly forgotten. After the parade had ended and the music faded into the distance, Elmsfield sank into an unusual kind of silence. People did not return immediately to their errands, did not rush into the family diner or the small grocery store as they usually did. They walked more slowly, spoke in softer tones, and every so often cast a glance toward the end of the street, where the old man in the wheelchair had just raised his hand in a final salute. That silence was not empty, it was reverence, as if the entire town had collectively set aside space for the hero they had only just discovered. Emily slowly pushed the wheelchair, guiding Frank away from Main Street. No one stopped them, but many eyes followed, as though seeing off an invisible company of soldiers. Frank said little. He simply gazed out the car window as Emily drove past familiar houses, trimmed lawns, and small flagpoles snapping in the breeze. His eyes did not linger on any one detail, as though he was searching for something beyond the view. When they arrived home, Emily helped him out of the car. Frank stubbornly refused the supporting hand, though his own trembled as if no longer willing to obey his command. Inside, he settled into the old chair by the window, afternoon light spilling across the faded uniform. Emily tidied a few things, trying to keep the air ordinary. But inside her, the silence weighed heavier than ever. She was about to speak when she saw Frank holding the small American flag, the very one he had handed her a few days before. He placed it carefully on the table, straight and deliberate, as though completing a ritual. Then he turned, took her hand, and whispered only, "Thank you for taking me where I needed to be." Emily nodded, forcing a smile to hide the tightness in her throat. She knew it was no coincidence he had chosen today, and in his eyes there was a peace she had never seen in him before. That night Elmsfield was still. At the end of Main Street, the porch light of Frank's home glowed, a small beacon into the dark. Inside the modest wooden room, he hung his uniform neatly by the door, as if it awaited another tomorrow. On the bedside table he placed an old photograph of a young soldier, mud-stained, smiling in a rare moment of war. In his arms was a comrade who remained outside the frame. Frank lay down, one hand resting on his chest. He left no note, no farewell words, no need for explanation. For him, the day had already said everything. He had saluted, He had been seen, he had been heard, and in that short sleep he slipped away, not with a sound, not with pain, only with stillness. The next morning, when Emily came to check on him, she found the room orderly, the uniform still hung, the photograph still in place. The old man she had once thought of as merely a gruff neighbor was gone. She sat quietly for a while, her eyes resting on the small flag on the table, and she knew Elmsfield would never be the same again. In the days that followed, the town seemed transformed. People stopped at his porch, leaving flowers, small flags, even handwritten cards of thanks. Strangers drove hours from other towns just to stand silently for a moment outside that modest home. An elderly woman, voice trembling, told Emily, "I must have walked past him dozens of times without knowing, but now I will never forget." There was even a moment that made Emily laugh through her tears. A boy left behind a soccer ball patched with silver duct tape as a late apology for all the times it had broken Frank's windows. Scrawled across it in messy letters were the words, "For you, hero." Frank was no longer there to see it, but his legacy had already begun. Stories spread, told in the family diner, in classrooms, in Sunday church pews. People spoke of him not for grand victories, but for his humility, for the way he always chose to stand at the end of the street, quiet yet resolute. In the eyes of Elmsfield, he was no longer an anonymous old man. He had become a symbol, and sometimes the most powerful symbols come from those who never ask for them. Do you think you can guess what happens next? Take a moment to relax. Leave a 1 or a "I'm still here" in the comments, and stay with us as the story continues. News of Frank Delaney's passing spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within a single night, the video of an entire unit halting to salute him had flooded social media. Hundreds of thousands of views, thousands of comments. People shared the story of an old man the town had once overlooked, now suddenly recognized as a symbol of silent sacrifice. The next morning, bouquets began appearing on the porch of the small house where he had lived. At first, it was just a few neighbors who brought them. Then came unfamiliar faces who had driven for hours from other towns. Veterans stood silently, raising a salute before the folded flag placed on the wooden table inside the living room. Children left lollipops and even a patched soccer ball, as if trying to return something to the old man they had once unknowingly disturbed. Frank's funeral was held at Elmsfield's small chapel, a space that normally held only a few dozen, but this time was packed to the doors. Those who could not get inside stood outside in the midday sun, holding small American flags, so silent that one could hear the faint rustle of cloth in the breeze. People did not speak loudly, did not tell stories aloud. They simply stood there, quietly present, as their way of saying thank you. The mayor gave a short speech, remembering Frank as a kind neighbor, a witness to history. But the moment that stilled the entire chapel came from Colonel Mendes, the son of the officer Frank had once saved. His voice trembled, but each word cut deep. Frank Delaney never wanted recognition, but this nation needs to know that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones sitting quietly at the end of the street, never telling their story. He saved my father's life, and he reminded us all that honor is not found in medals, but in the way we live and sacrifice for others. When the flag-draped coffin was carried out, 47 Marines, the same men who had halted during the parade, marched behind it. No brass band, no cheers. Only the steady rhythm of boots striking pavement, reminding everyone that Frank's legacy did not end in a single day but would live on in every step forward. That night, light appeared along Main Street. At first, only a few candles placed on Frank's porch. Then, they spread down the block, and then, across the entire town. One flame lit another, until the whole street glowed. It was not the light of mourning, but of gratitude. People stood side by side, elders, children, veterans leaning on canes, all gazing toward the little house where a soldier had lived and departed in silence. Someone chuckled softly when the children brought out their plastic parade horns, this time trying to play a makeshift hymn. The sound was warped and uneven, but no one complained. Instead, the crowd smiled, as if the clumsy notes fit perfectly with this small town where imperfection itself became unforgettable. Frank Delaney left without a monument, without a plaque, but it was precisely his humility that became his most powerful legacy. People told his story in history classes, at veterans' gatherings, at family dinners when courage was remembered. His name lived on, not in the blare of brass, but in quiet whispers. He once lived here, and he did the right thing. Some heroes are sculpted into stone, some are written into books, and some, like Frank Delaney, live quietly and leave quietly, yet leave behind a light in others that can never be extinguished. The story of Frank Delaney reminds us that the greatest heroes are often the ones who choose to live quietly, asking for no medals, no applause. They leave behind a legacy, not through words, but through silent deeds, through courage and integrity. Frank passed away in peace, but the light he ignited will live on in the hearts of all who witnessed it. In a world that grows louder every day, perhaps what we need most is to pause, to look around, to listen, and to acknowledge the quiet souls right beside us. Gratitude is not only a gift we give to them, it is also a remedy that heals our own hearts. If this story has touched you, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and pass it on so that more people may hear it. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so we can continue this journey of telling stories that reach deep into the heart of America. Because tomorrow, you just might encounter another Frank Delaney. And the question is, will you recognize them?